and we have to note this, by the Trump administration's repeated efforts to sabotage the count for political gain. The administration's refusal to let the Census Bureau experts, the career experts, determine the best schedule for completing the count and reporting results really created enormous chaos and confusion in the field. It undoubtedly undermined the work that we needed to do and tried to do to encourage marginalized communities to participate in the 2020 census. But the census isn't over, and it would be a mistake for anyone in the public or in the media to think that the census is over. What is over is the data collection phase of the census. Now that the Census Bureau has finished collecting the data from 150 million housing units and thousands of group facilities, from people experiencing homelessness or living in transitory locations like RV parks, the Bureau has actually moved into the next phase and begun that painstaking, complex work, highly specialized series of activities to process and improve the accuracy of the raw data. This work is crucial and it cannot be shortchanged. The Bureau faces an impossible deadline of December 31st, 2020 to review, process, tabulate, and report 2020 census reapportionment and redistricting data. That's according to the Bureau's own experts. You don't need to take it from me, but the Bureau's own experts, the Government Accountability Office, and the Commerce Department's Inspector General have stated how important and crucial it is for the Bureau to have additional time to do this very important data processing phase. The Census Bureau experts have been clear. Rushing the census is going to force the Bureau to cut corners and compress vital quality check activities, skewing census data for a decade, I should say, although the ramifications will last decades. An internal Census Bureau document actually warned that a rushed census could create, quote unquote, serious errors in the data. According to the CUNY mapping service, self-response rates in communities of color nationwide still tend to be lower than non-Hispanic white communities, and also tend to be lower than the US self-response rate overall. And the majority of census tracts that are predominantly Black, Hispanic, or American Indian, and a substantial tract of Asian tracts still have response rates that are less than the final rates in these same areas in 2010. This means that communities of color needed a greater share of door knocking enumeration and actually would have benefited from extra time. So in short, the risk of undercounts or data quality concerns fall disproportionately on communities of color. And let me just be clear about this, an inaccurate and incomplete 2020 census is going to hurt every state in the country, not just communities of color, but every state in the country. That's why Congress has to set a clear path forward. And the Leadership Conference, our big coalition of more than 200 organizations and many others are calling on Congress to take urgent action to push back the deadline for reporting apportionment and redistricting data by 120 days each, as the Trump administration itself had requested back in April before withdrawing that support. Even if Congress can't vote on the extensions now, we are urging leaders from both parties to let the Commerce Secretary and the Census Director know that they will push back the reporting deadlines, especially for apportionment, at the earliest legislative opportunity in a lame duck session. And the Bureau urgently needs more time to process the data. There's a bipartisan bill to save the census. It was introduced in the Senate by Senators Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan and Brian Schatz. The two senators from Alaska, one from Hawaii. The Leadership Conference endorsed this bill and the bipartisan House companion. There really isn't a roadmap for what comes next if the Census Bureau is forced to produce an inaccurate 2020 census. The bottom line is that without action from Congress, the Census Bureau is guaranteed to miss millions of people across every state, including people on rural and tribal lands, people of color, people with low incomes, and people experiencing homelessness, and therefore produce skewed data that is going to hurt our communities for a decade. In a lot of ways, this has always been the Trump administration's goal, from the failed citizenship question to Trump's unconstitutional memo trying to erase undocumented immigrants from the count or for congressional apportionment. The administration has been trying over and over again to dictate who counts in this country. And there's a domino effect at play. If you actually erase people from the census, the very tent poles of our democracy, like federal programs and fair elections, start to fall. Congressional action is the only way to safeguard the data in our democracy.
There has never been an accurate count of Latinos in the decennial census of the United States. Going back to the first census that included a Hispanic origin question in 1980, there have been efforts in every single census to undercount the Latino community, despite the fact that there are extreme barriers already that create such an undercount. In 1990, there were efforts, litigation, and legislation to prevent the inclusion of undocumented immigrants in that decennial count. In the 2000 census, our efforts to allow the scientists at the Census Bureau to correct the census data to make up for the undercount were prohibited from going forward. In the 2010 census, there were calls for immigrants to boycott the census. And now in 2020, we have had a political interference by the administration at levels that we have not seen in any of those previous censuses, with efforts to include a citizenship question, now the political interference of the administration of the Department of Commerce and the workings of the Census Bureau that we've seen over the past 6 months. And of course, the multiple disasters of the COVID pandemic, wildfires in states with large Latino populations, including California and Colorado and Oregon and Washington, and other natural disasters such as hurricanes in states including Florida and Texas that also have large Latino populations. So in many respects, the odds are consistently against a census that fully includes all Latinos, which is why Naleo Educational Fund, with hundreds of other Latino and non-Latino organizations, joined together to do everything we could to ensure that every single American resident was counted in the census, including all 60 million Latinos. The census isn't over. We've done all we can now to have people complete their census forms. And we know that given all the barriers that have been faced, the lingering effects of the political interference, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic that have disproportionately affected Latino households and families, that response rates in heavily Latino areas have been far below those of other parts of the country. So the fact that the Census Bureau touts a 99% completion rate of having counted all households is simply one that not only is it hard to believe, it is really not true. The Census Bureau may have touched 99% of the households on its address list, but we have no idea if everybody who lives in those households were included in the census. We have no idea if those census forms are actually complete with all the information that was supposed to be submitted. And we don't even know if that address list that the Census Bureau compiled included all addresses, even households without a US postal mailing address, which is why every single element of the census is important and why this next phase is even more critical for Latinos, the data processing phase. Now is the time for the Census Bureau to be able to fill in the blanks and complete the process by processing the data. The Census Bureau needs to go back and look at all these forms and determine which forms are incomplete, which forms indicated that there were family members for which there was no room to include the information, for which the Census Bureau has to go back and try to obtain information about those individuals. The Census Bureau now has to unduplicate responses that may have been submitted more than once from a single household. All this data processing is absolutely essential, especially for those population groups that are historically undercounted, like Latinos. And the fact that the administration is attempting to reduce the amount of time that the Census Bureau experts say they need to finish the job is further undermining a fair and accurate census. This is why we continue to call on Congress to take up its constitutional responsibility as being the entity that has the responsibility to ensure that a census is carried out every 10 years and extends the statutory deadlines for the delivery of the apportionment data from December 31st to April 31st, and the delivery of the redistricting data from April 1 to July 1. This will give the Census Bureau sufficient time to make sure it completes the processing and does what it can to include everybody who was not included in the initial self-response period. So the work isn't over, and at NALEO, we will continue working with our partners to ensure that we do all we can to salvage this foundation of our democracy.
The Trump administration has made countless efforts to sabotage this census, to erase historically undercounted communities, especially those which have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Make no mistake, the Trump administration has been deliberately undermining the census for purely partisan political gain. Now that the Supreme Court has allowed the census count to end early, the Bureau needs to undertake the massive and complex task of processing the raw data that it has collected related to 150 million housing units and other locations into data that accurately reflects each of our communities. This data is so important that the Asian American community, the fastest growing community in the United States, and other allied communities on this call, because it translates to real resources in our neighborhoods, real changes for our communities, and real implications for our political representation for the next 10 years. The post-data collection processing that we have been talking about is critical to identifying any errors and to ensure an accurate count. The current deadline for the Census Bureau to submit the final 2020 count to the president is December 31st, 2020. However, the Census Bureau has previously stated and made clear repeatedly that there is not enough time to meet this deadline and that it needed through April 30th of 2021 to ensure that it can conduct all the necessary data processing steps. Several lawsuits, including one by Advancing Justice AAJC along with MALDEF, have urged that the December 31 deadline must be set aside to ensure that the post-data processing is done properly. A federal judge in California agreed and issued a preliminary injunction, but that ruling has been put on hold while the decision is on appeal. This means that as of now, under the statutory guideline, the Census Bureau is tasked with conducting the post-processing in 6 weeks instead of the 6 months that it had previously planned. As to the July 21 presidential memo, a panel of 3 federal judges in New York ruled that on September 10, 2020, that excluding undocumented immigrants from the congressional apportionment count was unlawful. The Trump administration has appealed this ruling too, and the Supreme Court is scheduled to hear the case on November 30. I've said it before on many previous calls, and I will say it again today. The mandate of the United States Constitution says that all persons must be counted in the decennial census. The same is true for the apportionment count. The Constitution expressly states all persons. It does not state all citizens. The language of the Constitution is plain. Rushing to transmit apportionment data to the president by December 31 would undermine the accuracy of census data when we've worked so hard to push our communities to participate in the census and to tell them how it will benefit their lives. Everyone in America, regardless of political affiliation or ethnicity, should be deeply troubled by the president's attempt to undermine and misrepresent data from the 2020 census. Congress must act now to ensure the integrity and accuracy of census data and to ensure that it is preserved.
This summer, the National Urban League spearheaded litigation on behalf of civil rights organizations and local governments against Commerce Secretary Ross and Census Director Dillingham's planned rush census. We prevailed in the United States District Court for the Northern District of California, as well as the Federal Appellate Court for the Ninth Circuit. However, last week, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Census Bureau's plan to end the census count early, and they did it immediately. Now, I believe, and the National Urban League believes, that the Supreme Court has aided, abetted, facilitated, and have become willing co-conspirators in the administration's effort to politically interfere with the census, to upend the census, and yes, to cheat the American people out of their constitutional right to a representative government. necessary federal funds, and a fair and accurate census. The effort at political interference has been there from the beginning, from the addition of a census question, to the efforts to end the census early, to now an executive order seeking to exclude those who, quote, may not be American citizens from the count. All of these actions are unprecedented in their manner, in their scope, and fly in the very face of the notion of a fair, accurate, and complete census count. We have grave concerns about this continuing effort to shortchange the 2020 census. We believe that an accurate count, an accurate 2020 census count for the Black population was already in jeopardy from the start. And now many heavily populated African-American communities from Detroit, Michigan to across the South have not reached the Census Bureau's national 2020 census self-response rate of 68%, nor even last decade's 2010 census response rate. I caution you, do not be fooled by the Census Bureau's 99% completion rate myth. If there was ever fake news, this is it, the 99% completion rate myth. In the end, inaccurate, unchecked, unprocessed, and hastily tabulated 2020 census data will have a devastating effect on the nation and for populations already at risk, particularly from our point of view, young Black and brown children, immigrants, Black men of every age group, and now people residing in COVID-19 hotspots and hurricane-affected communities. So what's next, and where should we focus our attention? On November 30th, the Supreme Court will hold a hearing on President Trump's attempt to exclude undocumented immigrants from the apportionment process. This is an easy case. The executive order is not worth the paper it's written on and flies directly in the face of the intent of the Constitution, the text of the Constitution, the wording of the Constitution, and the spirit of the Constitution. And that proposal attempts by executive order to amend the Constitution, which clearly mandates, as previous speakers have indicated, a count of every person residing in the United States during these historic times. We cannot be silent, and we will not be silent. The civil rights community, local governments, people of all political stripes everywhere are going to make sure our voices are heard. We must vocalize the urgent need for Congress to take any action necessary to extend all of the statutory deadlines for census to submit the final census numbers to the White House and Congress for apportionment and redistricting. The Census Bureau's non-political technical staff are on record saying more time is needed to process the data. Let's listen to the experts. Let's excise the politics from the process. This Census Bureau is under a solemn obligation to fulfill its responsibilities and its mission. And the hardworking professional staff at the Census Bureau should not be continuously undermined by politics. Congress must provide the Census Bureau with time, and this census is not over. What will we do? We will continue to advocate. We will continue to fight. We'll continue to fight in the courts, in the Congress, and the court of public opinion to ensure that all Americans, all people who reside within the United States of America, and that means especially those who are most vulnerable, are going to be counted accurately, completely, and fully.
And our organization was founded in 1944 on a voting rights issue where American Indians were not allowed to vote in the states of New Mexico and Arizona because even though they were citizens of the United States, those states didn't consider them citizens of those states and tried to get in the way of their right to vote back in 1944, 45, and those years, and NCAA was founded on this. So this is extremely important to us to be focused on civic engagement issues that speak to our representation. We are also a community that is often invisible to most of this country. Many people, their only connection or knowledge of Indian country is through some inappropriate use of a mascot of a sports team, whether it be at the professional level, high school level, or college level. Many don't have any connectivity or knowledge that even the American Indian and their reservations exist today. And when we look at the census and how important that is to us, there's a couple things that come to mind. It has been raised by my colleagues, three things: funding, representation, and for Indian country, the data is very important to tribal leaders in managing their communities, in leading their communities. The United States has a treaty and trust responsibility to tribal nations in this country. There are over 380 treaties that were signed between tribal nations and the federal government that said, we are going to take care of you, your infrastructure, your healthcare, your education, economic development forever in exchange for the millions of acres that the tribal nations ceded to the United States for settlement. And when you look at it, bad census and improper numbers that fall short of really counting the number of American Indians and Alaska Natives that live in this country and where they are, the funding that is promised in those treaties is forever harmed. The representation that's promised in those treaties is forever harmed. In the previous census, Indian suffered an undercount that was more than 2 times the national average. Today, we see the self-response rate 25 percentage points below that of the national average. And although a lot of concerns exist with the barriers that existed with enumeration, that included this pandemic, where Indian country saw infection rates almost 4 times the national average and hospitalization rates almost 6 times the national average. We saw reservations have to close down their communities to keep their people safe because of the existing health disparities, because of decades of underfunding for healthcare. It's been really difficult for Indian country to get properly counted. And although we experienced all those concerns, and now apparently that is over and cut short, there are still many concerns left moving forward that really are threats also to an inaccurate count. The Census Bureau normally needs 5 months to process the data, and now there's less than 3 months to produce the apportionment counts, and the time to produce the redistricting file is decreased significantly, meaning that American Indians and Alaska Natives may not be accurately represented in the data. During the data processing period, important accuracy checks need to happen to the process of assessing the data. Without those checks, the data will become more inaccurate. And the use of administrative data is always a problem for American Indians and Alaska Natives, since race, ethnicity is often not present. There's also less time to allow stakeholders to give input on the disclosure avoidance system, and for the US Census Bureau to ensure that the data will be both private and accurate. Indian country has significant concerns that American Indian and Alaska Native data and data on tribal nations will be inaccurate also due to the disclosure avoidance system. There has never been enough of meaningful tribal consultation that is deserved in these kind of situations. This country has an obligation to communicate with Indian country, hear their concerns, and meet the challenges and find solutions that make sure we're not left behind or continue to be invisible to many parts of this country and invisible to the important funding that this country owes Indian country through the past couple of 100 years. We're really concerned and we really are not going to be quiet as we move forward on this.
The Census Bureau had initially planned that they needed 5 months to do the post-data collection processing. Then they revised that to 6 months as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And now they're planning to do it in 2.5 months. And there's a number of very important activities that have to happen there. For example, duplicate enumerations need to be removed from the census. Erroneous self responses also need to be identified, potential, and remediated. And very, very importantly, this period includes a number of checks that should be carried out to make sure that the computer programs the Census Bureau is using are carried out accurately. So what we do know from what the Census Bureau has said is that in order to meet this truncated schedule, they have eliminated 21 days of an operation that would identify and remediate computer errors. So I just can't imagine what would happen if the Census Bureau made a serious computer error that would affect apportionment and then discovered it well after the apportionment counts had been released. I think that would be terrible. Now let me talk about measures of quality. The Census Bureau has put out several measures at the national level of completion rates. Those do not translate into high quality data. So for example, the 1990 census had a very, very high completion rate, much higher than the 2000 and the 2010 census. And if anything, higher than the current 2020 census. However, the undercounts measured for the 1990 census were much, much larger than the undercounts measured for the 2000 census and the 2010 census. The 99.9% statistic doesn't tell you anything about the quality of the enumeration of each individual household that was counted. Arturo brought this point up, others have brought this point up. Now, are there indicators that could be used to understand the quality of the census? Well, yes. The American Statistical Association recently released recommendations for quality indicators that the Census Bureau could produce that would allow stakeholders to assess the fitness for use of the census data for apportionment, redistricting, and other uses. And I would strongly urge that the Census Bureau follow the recommendations of the American Statistical Association.